restart the timer. Yeah, so I have a hypothesis that I will be presenting for you guys. This is the first time I've given this talk. We'll see how it goes. But I'm essentially going to argue that many of the recent cultural changes we've been seeing in academia can be explained, at least in part, by the rapid increase in the percentage of scholars that are women. Okay, so in order to explain my hypothesis, I need to do a quick and dirty intro on evolved psychological sex differences. So men and women faced different evolutionary pressures. Therefore, they developed different physical characteristics, but they also developed different psychological preferences and priorities. And I'm going to use Joyce Bennenson's framework on men as warriors and women as worriers, because I think it's really useful for thinking out this particular domain of psychological differences. Okay, so for women to pass their genes, it was really important for them to stay alive longer than men needed to stay alive. Women need to stay alive not only the entire length of the pregnancy, but also many years into the child's development, because human children are not good at surviving on their own, and so it's really important for them to have a mother to take care of them. So women would have benefited from being risk avoidant, from befriending only highly trustworthy and also equal status others. They wouldn't want to affiliate too much with people above them because that would be threatening, or below them because that could put a target on their back. So they should prefer equal status relationships, and they should have high concern for protecting vulnerable others, specifically children, but this can also be translated into concern for other vulnerable people. Men, in contrast, in order to pass their genes, they needed to gain access to women. And one way, perhaps the primary way they did this, was by competing in coalitions to gain status within their community. So if they gained high status in their peer group, they were more attractive to women. Men were also willing to defer to their preferences and let them, have their pick of the ladies first, too. So this is happening on both sides. And then also they needed to cooperate within their peer groups in order to defeat other groups, because then they could potentially gain status to the women of other groups as well if they could eliminate them or potentially dominate them. So men would benefit more if they were they had strong desires to demonstrate their own merit to their peers to gain status among them, and building these status hierarchies based on who's particularly talented. They also should want to identify peers who are really talented and contribute to their own group as well. And they should prefer these maximally large groups. So as women want small, safe groups, men want large, competent groups. Okay, so in terms of research on these psychological sex differences, Joyce Bennenson's work is really informative and super interesting. If you haven't checked her out, every single paper in her entire CV is amazing. And I'll go through a couple of her findings. So she studies differences between both infants, children, teenagers, and young adults. So some of her findings include that males prefer and play more in groups as opposed to dyads, that they have larger networks, they affiliate more with peers, they're more tolerant of genetically unrelated peers, they dominate their peers to gain status, they affiliate more after conflicts and competitions. So if they dominate a peer or a peer dominates them, they make peace afterward and they stay friends. They affiliate more with peers of different ranks. So they're happy to affiliate with people above them and people below them. And they prefer friends with status potential. So they want friends who are highly competent, and they're more hierarchical and more meritocratic. Women, in contrast, they prefer, and also girls, they prefer dyads. They are more likely to terminate friendships, exclude allies, ostracize teammates, and eliminate competition. So even when we're talking about members of women's own in-group, if something bad happens, they're more likely to kick them out of the group forever. They hold grudges longer, so if there's a conflict, they're not as quick to resolve that conflict and become friends again. They prefer to pare down large groups, and they do this via ostracism. So when they're in large groups, this poses a potential threat. So they slowly pare their group down to a safe, small, loyal group. They also tend to display more empathy and are more likely to help victims. So when they see others suffering, they're more inclined to reach out to help them. And they prefer friends who are loyal, and they're also more egalitarian. So again, they don't want people above them, but they also don't want people below them. Just to give you a sense of one of her studies that I think is pretty interesting. So she had, I think these were like 3 to 5 year olds. And she had boys and girls evaluate these two colorings, and they had a set of stickers to distribute to these two different colorings. And she just looked at what percentage of the children distributed the stickers equally, as opposed to giving more stickers to the better coloring. And across these different samples, you can see that girls are more likely to distribute the stickers equally, whereas boys are more likely to give more stickers to, relatively more likely, to give more stickers to the good coloring. Okay. Why is this relevant to academia? Okay, so academia, many institutions, including academia, were typically created by men and for men, so it only makes sense that their priorities would sort of be built into the institutions. So if you look across, I think probably all countries, and probably not all universities, some were started as women's colleges, but almost all universities, women joined academia much later, sometimes hundreds or more years later than men. So we can see male preferences in the structure of academia. So they have these large merit-based hierarchies where people are competing to publish papers, to get good grades, and get promotions, things like that. And there's direct competition for status. So I'm trying to show that my ideas are better than your ideas. But very recently, this is from the United States, but the US shows similar patterns to many European countries. The US is maybe a little bit more ahead in terms of the dominance of women, but you can see starting around, see if I can see my own graph. I don't know, like maybe 2017, the majority of PhD recipients in the United States are women. And starting in 2018 or 2019, it looks like, I probably said the wrong thing. Anyway, point is, not only are women dominating at the undergraduate level, they now are getting more PhDs, and they now also are more faculty. So women now are like in control. If one sex was in control of academia, it's now women in that they have more numbers. So this should have some predictable consequences if men and women have slightly different preferences for social structures and the resolving of conflicts. So we should see an increased preference for equity over merit-based hierarchies. We should see increased preference for harm avoidance scholarship, and we should see increased ostracism in response to conflict. So is there any evidence to support these predictions? Increased preference for equity over merit-based hierarchies. Many universities have gotten rid of standardized testing, which were a means of evaluating people's merit and their capacity to perform well in college. We have a grade inflation problem, which I learned from Luana at a FIRE faculty conference. High school GPAs have been skyrocketing, and the average GPA is now like, I don't even know, like a 3.7. And this cannot be explained by students being smarter these days, because actually in standardized testing, the new cohorts are performing the worst in a really long time. So they're not showing as much capacity to succeed, but they're getting really high grades pretty much universally. We have the introduction of many of these diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. Note the word equity. And a lot of more money is going to promoting these agendas. Is there increased preference for harm avoidance scholarship? Many universities have started putting trigger warnings on books and also using them in class to warn their students about potentially psychologically upsetting content. Many universities have started to include safe spaces on campus, and particularly directed toward groups that people perceive as vulnerable. Many universities have started these anonymous reporting systems where anybody can file an anonymous complaint against anyone, including for things that were said, in order to make students feel psychologically safer. These are FIRE data of scholars targeted for their speech on campuses. And we see that over time, more and more scholars are getting targeted for things they said, and typically this is, not, I don't want to say always, but if you look through the cases, it's usually based on speech that could be perceived as harmful, and specifically harmful to particular groups of people that are considered vulnerable. We are reaching record highs of papers that are retracted. Of course, many of these are based on like data fraud or errors, but again, if you look through the data sets, you can see often they're morally motivated as well. And then we have these editorial changes at, this is Springer Nature, but it's the most prestigious scientific publisher in the world, I think, where they are literally saying they might reject or retract science if it has potential to cause harm, if the dissemination of the science has potential to cause harm. This is in response to the Al-Shebly paper on female mentors. After that happened, Nature Springer came out and was apologizing for harming women, and now they're going to, strengthen their determination to DEI. Okay, is there increased ostracism in response to conflict? Has anybody heard of cancel culture? This is a female conflict strategy. So whereas men would typically punish someone, their status goes down a bit, but they keep them in the group, and they have to climb back up the hierarchy. Women would tend to ostracize people forever and permanently, regardless of their contribution. So it's not about merit, it's about, are you a safe person to be around? And if not, then I want nothing to do with you. So this kind of permanent exclusion from polite society would be like a more female-oriented conflict resolution strategy. Okay, so those are sort of all anecdotes. What are the actual data show? I'm only going to present probably about half of the data that I'm aware of for the interest of time, but there's a lot of data supporting these differences between both undergraduates, men and women in the public, and then also male and female academics. So in a 2017 survey conducted by YouGov in the United States, a majority of men said colleges should not protect students from offensive ideas. A majority supported controversial speakers' right to speak on campus. They said colleges should not disinvite speakers if students threaten violent protest. And they opposed confidential reporting systems at colleges for reporting offensive comments. For all of these, a majority of women held the exact opposite views. So the majority said colleges should be protecting students from ideas. They opposed controversial speakers' right to speak. They said colleges should disinvite speakers if students threaten violent protest, and then they supported confidential reporting systems. A 2018 Knight survey of, this is about 4,400 college students. A majority of men reported that protecting free speech is more important than promoting an inclusive society, and said it was never acceptable to shout down speakers. For both of these, a majority of women said the opposite. So they reported that promoting an inclusive society is more important than free speech, and that it is, I think it was like sometimes or always acceptable to shout down speakers. A 2021 survey conducted by, I think it's the Center for the Study of Political Ideology. They surveyed around 3,700 academics and PhD students in the US, Britain, and Canada, and found that 66 to 76% of men support intellectually foundational texts above diversity quotas, whereas 44 to 66% of women supported diversity quotas above foundational texts, and also found that female academics were more supportive of dismissal campaigns against colleagues who reach controversial conclusions. A study by Rausch et al. Of undergraduates, they had a task where they, undergraduates, grads, and PhD students had a task where they had 100 points to allocate to different priorities. So they had to, choose some over the others. Men tended to allocate more points toward academic freedom and advancing knowledge relative to women, and women were relatively more likely to allocate more points toward social justice and emotional well-being. These are data from a very recent paper of mine, studying 470 psychology professors in the United States. I asked the question, should scholars be completely free to pursue research without fear of institutional punishment for their conclusions? The majority of men said yes. Fewer said it's complicated, and almost none said no. Among women, the majority said it's complicated. Fewer said yes, and very few said no. For the question, if pursuit of truth and social equity goals appear to come into conflict, which should scientists prioritize? The majority of men said truth, fewer said it's complicated, and almost none said equity. Among women, the majority said it's complicated, fewer said truth, and almost none said equity. I don't know if you guys can, yeah, you can probably read that. So this is still with psychology professors. Here we have differences in desire to discourage research across 10 different controversial conclusions. And for almost all of them, here is the relevant P less, I don't know how many people know stats, but anyway, except for this one, which is racial bias in academia. We see that women have a stronger desire to discourage their peers from approaching any of these controversial topics. Over here, we have gender differences and support for actions against taboo scholars. So this is, if a peer affords a controversial conclusion, which kinds of things should we do to these people? And with the exception of normal scientific criticism, which men and women equally supported, and also I think stigmatizing graduate students and co-authors, we saw that women were more supportive of all of these punishments. So women were more supportive of socially ostracizing them, publicly labeling them pejorative terms such as bigot, racist, sexist, disinviting them from talks, refusing to publish their work regardless of its merits, not hiring or promoting them even if they meet typical standards, firing them, shaming them on social media, and removing them from leadership positions. So across the board, women are more supportive of all of these punish peers who forward conclusions that have potential to cause harm, including things like firing them and permanently, booting them out of academia. Okay, so my hypothesis is essentially this. If you have groups of people who have slightly different preferences and priorities on average, the blue people and the pink people here, and then you fundamentally alter the composition of that group to a group of people that have slightly different preferences and priorities on average, you're going to find yourself, there's gonna be some conflict, okay? People are gonna start having strong disagreements about what are the optimal values and norms in science. And that this would happen almost inevitably when we're relying on our intuitions about what is good for society and what is good for science. So this shift between maybe a system that made a lot of sense to men because it was built by men and men had these more shared intuitions is now being called into question by people who have slightly different psychological preferences and priorities. So typically around this time, if I'm talking about this on Twitter, somebody will be like, women shouldn't be allowed to vote. And that's not what I'm saying. Or someone would be like, kick women out of science. And that's not what I'm saying either. I enjoy science, it's very fun. And I used to kind of toss up my hands and say, this is a descriptive account. I'm providing an explanation. I'm not saying what we should do about it. I'm not saying that it's a problem and that there has to be a solution, blah, blah, blah. I'm just saying this is what's happening. We have a conflict. Pretty much everyone sees it. And this is a potential explanation for that conflict. But now I think I have at least one idea. So I think our best bet to resolve some of these conflicts without, violating human rights or, violating Merton's norms of science and kicking women out of science, I think what we need to do is take the time to collect data on our conflicting intuitions and see which intuitions are right, and testing our norms and policies for science and say which ones advance science better, faster, and help human progress. So rather than just relying on our intuitions, which men and women have competing intuitions on average, or conflicting intuitions on average, we need to test the intuitions and test our norms and policies. So I'm doing some of this. So this was a paper, maybe came out last fall, where I went through all of the things that scientists are asserting on both sides of the debate that are just based on intuitions, that this is good, that's bad. Well, we need evidence for what is good and what is bad. Can we have science pursue truth without, first, is it causing harms in the first place? And if so, are there other ways of minimizing those harms without censoring science? These are questions that nobody's testing, and I think they should be. So for a lot of these censorship attempts are based on these harm concerns. So for example, the Al-Shebly paper with the female mentors, they were like, these findings will undermine women in science. Well, how do they know that? They just said it. No data, they just said it. And so this paper was I looked at that specific paper, but then also 4 other controversial papers, and I found that those intuitions are exaggerated. So people tend to think people will support more harmful reactions than they do in reality. People don't read that paper and say, women shouldn't be allowed to mentor people anymore. And so I think that we need to collect the data underlying these intuitions. This is a paper I published a couple weeks ago, which was where I got those gender difference results from, where I found that actually almost no psychology professors think harm concerns are a legitimate reason to interfere with science. They don't think we should be rejecting or retracting papers on the basis of harm concerns, and that's true of both men and women. Almost no men and almost no women think harm concerns are a legitimate reason to suppress science. I don't think anybody would have sensed that from our fights on Twitter, but now we know, at least among these psychology professors. And I'm not the only one doing this kind of work. So for example, this was a paper on trigger warnings, and a lot of these universities and professors who were using trigger warnings were doing so under the assumption that they're protecting students from harm. Well, it turns out that the trigger warnings might often backlash and actually cause students more psychological harm. And so I think as a result of this research, a lot of people have started to get rid of those trigger warnings. Many universities that got rid of standardized testing just very recently have brought it back because people thought getting rid of standardized testing will promote equity, it'll help the students at the bottom perform better. Turns out it actually makes them perform worse. They get mismatched with schools, and they get worse grades and are more likely to drop out. So it's harming the very people they're supposed to help. So collecting this data helped us learn, oh, okay, standardized testing is actually working. Maybe we bring it back. We have something similar happening with the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. Almost every university in the US had these. You had to write a thing saying how you were committed to it if you wanted to apply for a job. Almost all the prestigious universities are now getting rid of these, and they're also rolling back budgets on these groups because it turns out that they're really, really expensive and they don't accomplish what they say they're accomplishing. So I think we can resolve many of these conflicts that might occur just based on natural differences in the intuitions between men and women. But if we collect the data, we can just come to the best solutions via science, and we don't just have to fight about, you know, based on our preferences, that are untested preferences that are not based on data. So my solution now is I think we actually can appeal to the shared priorities of men and women, which is to advance student science society, but we just have to collect the data to understand and learn which norms and policies are going to work best, and this is something we haven't been forced to do yet because we were relying on a more shared set of intuitions that weren't coming into conflict, and they are now. Yeah, so that is all.
So great talk, thank you very much. Very clear data. And so are there any questions? Yes.
Can I ask one?
Yes, so you ask first and then we will have. Okay.
Who's going first?
Yes,
oh, Peter.
Go.
Peter.
Hello. Yeah, it was a beautiful talk and beautiful statistics and much of what I experienced only when I mentioned that I have some feminists immediately going after me. I wonder really how your experience is when you publish data like that, if you have difficulties with certain groups attacking you.
Yeah, a lot of people don't like me. But no, I've managed to be pretty productive regardless of that. I think one thing that I've discovered in my work is that the biggest changes and the most conflict is actually coming from a very small group of people. So even though we have these differences between men and women are overrepresented among the group of people that are supporting a particular set of priorities, actually it's a very vocal minority that straight up will come out and say, like, no, these moral values come above pursuit of truth. No, we should be firing professors for empirically correct claims because we don't like the conclusions. That's a small group of people, and I think I thought that group was a lot larger like 3-4 years ago than I do now, and now I think, and actually I didn't report this, you guys will like the statistic. In my taboos paper, I had a question, how much admiration versus contempt do you have toward peers who petition to retract papers on moral grounds? And this was on a 0 to 100 point scale, 100 being maximum admiration and respect, 100 being maximum contempt, or sorry, 0 being maximum contempt. And the modal response was 0. So it's actually the vocal minority that everybody really dislikes, and it's not the scholars advocating for academic freedom. People have more respect for those people, and they don't respect the people who are trying to shut down science for moral reasons. So I actually think the majority of people the vast majority of people support academic freedom. They just don't say so out loud because they're afraid of being the next one with the target on their back. So I think that's why I've been relatively able to publish this work without too much trouble.
What I just meant is that feminists usually don't accept that there are certain biological traits which makes...
Oh.
That is the issue.
Yeah, some people I know who studied sex differences more directly. I really don't. Like, I rely on that work, but I don't study it myself. They have problems talking about this stuff. But, you know, I'm doing an adversarial collaboration right now on sex differences between people who say there are no psychological sex differences and who are, and even there, people are pretty civil. Again, it's like a small group of people, like a small group of bad apples that's making all of us think we hate each other more than we really do. And I think we could get along better if we identified the bad apples rather than, you know, attacking people with different perspectives, you know, on scale.
Thank you for your presentation. I agree that especially Twitter is very polarized and not really a representative of the society as a whole, has opinions. I have two questions. The first one is if you could go back to the table and just help me understand the one with normal scientific criticism. Mm-hmm. Could you help me read the numbers, please?
Yeah, so this one there was no, I probably should have presented the graphs, but the graphs are actually really hard to see too. So for normal scientific criticism, support for that one was near ceiling for men and women. So both men and women are strongly supportive of normal scientific criticism and to virtually equal levels. So there's no difference there.
Okay, thank you. And the other question is, do you think that since the roles of each sex is changing in society, do you think that these different priorities between men and women will come to just cease to exist and just be kind of harmonized since women are taking on more roles in society and we will just have this compromise that will come?
Yeah, so there are two things there. One is the biological element, so how much of this is part of like our hardwired psychology because of different evolutionary pressures for men and women. However, even that can potentially change because we have, for example, birth control now, and we have really good healthcare, and we don't usually let singles moms, their children die. So it is possible that we will get less selection along those lines in the future, but that would take would it take thousands, hundreds of thousands of years? But then there's also the cultural element. And actually one thing, this is another hypothesis I haven't really collected data on it, but another thing that I think potentially could happen is because women are going to be dominating these institutions in the future, and men are dropping out. But men are really good at learning how to climb status hierarchies, that men are adopting female priorities in order to compete in academia. And so I think men will actually become more feminine because women will be the ones saying who wins and who gets promotions and stuff. So that would be a cultural way they could merge. In terms of women changing, I'm not sure because they might not have to if they're sort of like controlling things. But again, if some of their intuitions are wrong, then I think collecting data, I think women are receptive to data. And if they learned that trigger warnings are actually harming their students, they might stop using them. So yeah, that could happen.
Yes, as a compliment, I totally agree, of course, with your work. My data on the Canadian is the same. Now they are dominant at the PhD. It's a demographic thing. It's obvious. The point is about the minority. It's very important, and I would add that my experience is that not only is there a minority, but this vocal, very, very small minority are in fact attacking only the weak. I look at the university, they look at part-time woman teacher. They never attacked me. And I said, this is why. I said, I think that they know that they have no argument. They know if they attack me, I will answer them. So they never do that. And I expect that from what we see here, you have very strong argumentation. They will say, okay, if we attack her, maybe she will retaliate. And so I always insist that those four, we just not listen to them. And it's very important because rector, university president, provost tend to listen to them. I said, look, it's vocal, but there are four. The large majority of men and women just don't intervene. But your data shows that they are for normal critical criticism. Okay, they are a little bit more woke, but not as active. So I think this idea that they attack at least in our university, all the cases of attacking teachers have all of them been on women, and the majority was part-time women. We say, okay, I will not teach that anymore because I want to renew my teaching next fall. And one of them in Ottawa was not renewed for her teaching, so she lost her job, which was a part-time job. It was not a tenure track. But those who are tenured overestimate the vocality of those very, very small, 1 over 50, but they are very pit bull. You know, they attack, and we should be aware of this attacking.
Yeah, so I've heard people make that argument that they go after the weak. I'm not 100% sure it's true, but it's hard to answer. So like you can look at the fire faculty data, and I think probably men are targeted more than women. That's hard because in certain disciplines where people are getting attacked, and also people that people are paying attention to, the higher status people, might be more likely to get attacked. And then also I find that men believe in controversial conclusions more than women. So men actually believe the things that are getting attacked more. So there's a lot you'd have to control for there. But another interesting thing I saw was that tenured and untenured professors in my sample are self-censoring at the exact same amount, and they're also just as afraid of everything bad happening to them. And I think it's potentially because the things that scholars fear most, it's not getting fired, it's that they don't want to be ostracized and they don't want to be called names on Twitter. And you know, tenure doesn't help with that. So that's what's really causing people to self-censor, is they want to be liked. It's a very human thing, and it's true of everyone. So it doesn't matter if you have tenure. I can destroy your reputation. It's going to get added to your Wikipedia page, and your legacy is going to be you're a racist, and nobody wants that. So, yeah, it's challenging.
So I have 2 questions, in fact. One is when you subdivide the females and you subdivide the males, are there females that have a more male psychology, and there are men who have a more female psychology? How that fits, and what are in fact the averages and the percentage?
Yeah, so always talking overlapping bell curves.
Yes.
So these are average differences. Plenty of men, some of the most extreme people are men, and also the men, I think, because they're more comfortable with direct conflict. Often it's these extremist men with somewhat more female psychology, but also more male, because they're more aggressive, are the ones that are most like aggressively going after peers, whereas like women are kind of piling on, but not necessarily launching all of these attacks. But yeah, I think in terms of ratio of men and women, I mean, it varies from question to question. So like here, this is a pretty huge difference, especially there, like almost, well, not quite 70% of men are saying we should be pursuing truth first, and women are above 50% are saying that we should be balancing truth and equity. But I don't know, like, of course some men are, you know, what is it, 30% of men are saying it's complicated, so they're responding the way most women respond. So yeah, it's overlapping, and they're more feminine, or rather men with more female priorities. And I think men with more female priorities are more likely to respond to these questions the way women do, and women with more male priorities are more likely to respond to these questions the way men do.
Okay, thanks. So just one final question. There has been a paper, I don't know if this paper is your paper, for hiring. You know, there's the hiring.
Oh, you conservatives?
From universities. What is, and the biases have shifted in 2009, I think.
Oh, yeah.
With this story, the biases have shifted in 2009.
Oh, yeah,
and so can you explain a little bit?
I'm a low-level co-author on that paper. Yeah, no, that paper was just looking at hiring bias in the workplace between male and female applicants. So it was taking identical resumes that were submitted to jobs with male and female names, for the most part anyway, and it was a meta-analysis of maybe 47 studies over the past 40 years or something. And we looked at male stereotypical and female stereotypical neutral jobs. And we found that callbacks for female stereotypical jobs always have and still do favor women over men, but callbacks for males over females for male stereotypical jobs. That was true until around 2009, and since then it's reversed. So now women are preferred for all kinds of jobs over men. Yeah.
Just a very brief comment. 2 years ago, we did a survey which shows also a new variable that is not there because you are in the United States, but in Quebec we have two communities, and there was a correlation, very clear correlation between the Anglo, which were much more influenced by the American debates, and people like us, the Franco, which much more for the criticism against the wokeism, which was very strong in Anglophone universities, which explains what's going on at McGill, at Concordia, that we don't find in most French universities. So there was also this cultural variables in Quebec between Francophones and Anglophone with correlations well constructed as a complement, because the world is not only in the United States.
Yeah, I would like people to study this in other cultures, because I'm sure it's similar but different too, in a lot of ways, yeah.
Thank you. I just have a quick question. Have you ever thought, I guess yes, but because it's not shown here, any comparative studies with other countries that are with different backgrounds, for example, maybe Eastern areas, just to see how if there is correlation or if there is no correlation?
Yeah, I have not studied these specific gender differences in different countries, and all of the ones I'm aware of are in the Anglosphere. I don't even know of any in Europe. Is that true? Let me think about that for a sec. I'm not sure. But no, mostly this is all done in US, Canada, England, Australia, New Zealand. I would expect similar patterns in Europe. I'm less sure if we would see similar things in like China, for example. I have no idea. So yeah, study them and let me know.
So talking about differences, so you said, you know, that we have to look at the mean average values, but also at the distribution, the variance. You remember, we remember Larry Summers, some 20 years ago or so, made a ruckus with saying, you know, they are not differences in the mean, certain properties, capacities, and it was intellectual capacity or something, and not differences in the mean, but differences in the variance. That are gender specific. Can you comment on that? Yeah, in my experience, pretty much anything you look at, psychological differences, I'm not sure if it's true of physical differences, maybe you know, but psychological differences, there's always more variance among men than women. But there are also mean differences too. Here there are mean differences, and regardless of whether you account for the fact that there's more variation among men than women, those differences are there. But it is true that men tend to be more spread out on just about anything you would ask them. That was controversial because it was made for intelligence, although now I think it's possible we understand that men actually do have a slightly higher average IQ, but also they're more represented at the top and at the bottom, because again, pretty much always more variance for men than women. Why is that? Oh, it's been a while. You probably know better than I do.
Closer to the average. I don't know if that fully explains, but it's one of the many hypotheses.
Yeah, one could just be also that, yeah, men should be displaying more diversity because they are taking like riskier strategies than women, whereas women should be doing what works and doesn't kill you. So that could be potential, but yeah, I'm not 100% sure. It's in physical too, they have more variability. Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have to go ahead. Thank you very much. Very nice presentation. Thanks.